Good morning and welcome back. One of the most misunderstood moments in a superintendent interview is the follow up question. Candidates can get in their heads and immediately assume something's gone wrong. Maybe you're thinking, my answer must not have been good enough, or I must have missed what they were asking, or maybe I need to explain myself better. While you're in the hot seat, that reaction is understandable. But after analyzing superintendent interview transcripts from multiple superintendent searches, I found something very different. Follow up questions rarely happen because the board didn't understand your answer. They happen because the board wants to observe your leadership. That distinction changes things for you. Most superintendent candidates prepare for interview questions. School boards are evaluating something else. Through executive interview intelligence, each episode explores the leadership signals, decision making patterns, and executive behaviors that influence superintendent hiring decisions so you can make your executive leadership visible before the board makes its hiring decision. Recognized as one of the top 10 K 12 podcasts on Podomatic, Executive Interview Intelligence is built on the analysis of real superintendent interviews. We've now analyzed more than 150 superintendent interview questions and responses to uncover the hidden executive evaluations taking place throughout the hiring process so that you can focus on leveling up, accelerate your professional trajectory, and prepare for a future where you're leading a district and improving students' lives. This is Executive Interview Intelligence Research Observation number 79. As I continued comparing superintendent interviews from different districts, I noticed something that was happening consistently. The first question usually invites candidates to introduce themselves, their experience, their background, some of their leadership philosophy, who they are as a person, but the interview doesn't stay there. Almost immediately, the questions become more specific, more practical, and then more observable. Each follow up question removes another layer of the abstraction until the committee can begin seeing how the candidate actually leads. Let's look at what happened. In one superintendent search, candidate one was asked the familiar opening question: tell us about yourself. Why are you interested in becoming our next superintendent? The candidate responded by describing years of leadership experience, district responsibilities, professional preparation, and the values that had shaped a career in education. Strong opening. Notice what happened. The board didn't ask another question about the candidate's background. Instead, they shifted immediately. Based on your research about our district, what do you believe are the two or three most critical long-term priorities we must address? And how do your background and skills position you to lead that work? The interview changes at that moment with that follow-up question. The board no longer wanted to know who this leader was. They wanted to know how the leader thought. The candidate responded by discussing enrollment decline, attendance, academic proficiency, community trust, and connected each priority back to specific district conditions. Then came another shift from the board. They asked, what specific qualities and capabilities do you bring to this position that may set you apart from others? Take a look at what happens next. The board no longer accepted leadership claims. Now they wanted evidence. Instead of saying, I'm fiscally responsible, the candidate described researching a proposed land sale, discovering future commercial development, and negotiating an increase from a proposed 300,000 sale to a $2.6 million sale. The follow-up question forced executive leadership into view. It wasn't because the first answer was wrong. The board just wanted greater context because executive leadership becomes visible through executive decisions, and that's what the board is digging for. The same pattern appeared again in a completely different superintendent search. Candidate 2 began by sharing a personal leadership journey. Talked about relationships, mentorship, professional growth, and his values. Everything you would expect from one of those opening interview questions. The committee listened, then immediately asked this follow up. Based on your research about our district, what do you believe are the two or three most critical long term priorities we must address? Again, that changes the conversation. The candidate stopped talking about leadership philosophy and began discussing enrollment recovery, district identity, teacher retention, student achievement, and MTSS implementation. Then we had another follow up. What specific qualities and capabilities do you bring to this position that may set you apart from others? Again, the board wasn't collecting more information. They were asking for observable leadership. The candidate answered by describing organizational stability, relationship building, long term leadership, and why sustained executive presence mattered for the district's future. The interview had moved from leadership philosophy to executive behavior, and then in another superintendent search, another board, another state, we again see that pattern. Candidate 3 opened by describing a career in education, what attracted the candidate to the district, and priorities for the first 90 days. Again, solid opening, pretty consistent across the board, but the committee wasn't finished evaluating. The next question moved immediately into instructional leadership. The district has developed a portrait of a learner. How would you ensure this vision translates into tangible outcomes across grades 7 through 12? And what would success look like in year 3 of your tenure? Notice what happened here. The board didn't ask the candidate to explain the district's vision. They asked the candidate to operationalize it, to make it real, and define success. The candidate now had to explain what classrooms would look like, what students would experience, how progress would be measured, and what observable improvement should exist 3 years into the future. Then another follow-up. The committee shifted again. Now they asked about curriculum alignment, professional development, assessment, high-quality instructional materials. And then there was another follow-up about data-driven instruction, not as a definition, as executive leadership in action. The committee asked for a time when data had actually changed outcomes for students. The candidate responded with a district-wide initiative, talked about student survey data, faculty collaboration, professional learning, advisory structures, observable changes in student connectedness over time. So you can see that progression now. The committee wasn't asking random follow-up questions. Each question required the candidate to move from describing leadership to demonstrating leadership. The exact progression appeared again during another superintendent interview in the same search. Candidate 4 began by discussing a leadership journey, a district experience, and the first 90-day plan. The committee then shifted to educational vision, curriculum innovation, instructional leadership, data, continuous improvement, regional governance, and at one point the committee even interrupted the sequence here and literally said, "Can I ask a follow-up question?" And that moment shows us that when most candidates hear a follow-up and assume they need to defend their previous answer, that you don't really need to do that all the time. It depends where you're at, but here's what we noticed. The committee wasn't challenging the candidate. The committee was changing the evaluation and looking for something else. The first response explained the curriculum initiative. The follow-up shifted to instructional materials. Then another follow-up shifted to curriculum alignment, and another shifted to assessment. The candidate wasn't simply answering more questions. He was making executive leadership progressively more visible. That's the pattern. Appeared again and again and again across these different districts, across these different committees, across these different states. The strongest research finding wasn't that school boards ask follow-up questions. It was why they asked them. Every follow-up removes another layer between what a candidate says and how that candidate actually leads. By the time an interview is nearing its conclusion, the committee isn't evaluating the interview performance. They're evaluating executive leadership. And that changes how superintendent candidates should prepare. Because if you believe follow-up questions happen because your first answer was a mistake or needed some clarity, your preparation becomes a little bit defensive. You'll try to anticipate follow-up questions, memorize additional examples, and worry about saying enough. But if you understand that the questions are or the question's purpose is to make your executive leadership visible, then your preparation changes. You don't have to prepare for more questions. What you're preparing for is to reveal your executive operating system from every angle that the board chooses to explore. So your goal is to be consistent over time. You can download your complimentary decision chain analysis and discover what your interview is really communicating before the board makes its hiring decision. You, you can go to analysis.next-level at leadershipinterviewprep.com and use that free assessment to see what your responses are revealing to potential school boards. Most superintendent candidates believe follow-up questions happen because their first answer wasn't good enough. The research suggests something different. After analyzing those 150 superintendent interview questions and responses from real superintendent searches, we saw that consistent pattern that emerged. School boards don't ask follow-up questions because they need more information. They ask follow-up questions because each follow-up creates another opportunity to observe executive leadership. Thank you for listening to this episode. And remember, until next time, keep making your executive leadership visible before the board makes its hiring decision. Have a great day.